Chapter 1. The Heat of Routine. The scorching summer sun beat down on Folsom, California, as Mike Walker stepped out of his modest welding shop, wiping the sweat from his brow. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal, and the hum of machinery echoed through the quiet streets. Mike had been running his family's welding business for over 2 decades, a steady routine that had seen him through both good times and bad. Adjusting his worn leather gloves, Mike surveyed the familiar surroundings: the Palladio shopping center across the street, the historic district with its quaint buildings, and the distant glimmer of Folsom Lake. It was a town he knew like the back of his hand, a place he called home. Yet, as he listened to the faint chirping of birds and the occasional rumble of a passing car, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been nagging at him for the past few days. Mike had been following the news reports about the strange outbreaks of violence and the mysterious virus spreading in nearby Sacramento. The media had been in a frenzy, speculating about the cause and the potential for the outbreak to spread. But Mike, ever the pragmatist, had dismissed the reports as nothing more than sensationalism. After all, Folsom had always been a quiet, peaceful community, insulated from the troubles of the outside world. As he stepped back into his shop, the familiar hiss of the welding torch and the rhythmic clanging of metal on metal provided a comforting backdrop to his thoughts. Mike had spent countless hours in this space, crafting custom pieces for his customers and tinkering with his own projects. The welding torch, with its brilliant blue flame, was an extension of his hands, a tool he wielded with precision and skill. Today, Mike was working on a custom railing for a local homeowner, the intricate design taking shape under his practiced touch. He moved with a fluid grace, his muscles rippling beneath his sweat-stained shirt as he bent and twisted the metal, shaping it to his will. This was his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the task at hand and forget the worries of the world beyond his shop. As the afternoon wore on, Mike took a break, wiping his brow and sipping from a cold bottle of water. He glanced at the small television in the corner, where the news was playing on a constant loop. The reports had only grown more frantic, with images of chaos and violence flashing across the screen. Mike frowned, his skepticism still firmly in place. "Bunch of nonsense," he muttered, turning his attention back to his work. "Ain't nothing gonna happen here. Not in good old Folsom." The rest of the day passed in a familiar rhythm, the clanging of metal, the hiss of the welding torch, and the occasional break to refuel and hydrate. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the shop, Mike finally set down his tools and surveyed his handiwork. The railing was a masterpiece, the intricate design a testament to his skill and craftsmanship. With a satisfied nod, Mike removed his gloves and safety goggles, ready to head home for the evening. As he stepped outside, the air had cooled slightly, but the oppressive heat still lingered. Mike took a deep breath, savoring the familiar scents of his town, the earthy aroma of the nearby lake, the faint scent of blooming flowers, and the ever-present tang of metal and gasoline. "Just another day in Folsom," he murmured, locking up the shop and making his way to his truck. As he drove through the quiet streets, passing the familiar landmarks, Mike felt a sense of contentment wash over him. This was his home, his sanctuary, and nothing was going to disrupt the peaceful routine he had built for himself. Little did he know, the tranquility of Folsom was about to be shattered, and his life would be irrevocably changed. Chapter 2. The Shift. The next morning dawned with an eerie stillness that sent a shiver down Mike's spine. As he stepped out of his house, the oppressive heat already beginning to build, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual morning bustle of Folsom was conspicuously absent, replaced by an unsettling quiet that seemed to blanket the entire town. Mike climbed into his truck, the engine's rumble a stark contrast to the silence around him. He flipped on the radio, expecting to hear the usual morning talk show, but was met with nothing but static. Frowning, he fiddled with the dial, searching for a clear signal. "Come on, you piece of junk," he muttered, smacking the dashboard in frustration. Finally, a faint voice crackled through the speakers, barely audible above the static. "Stay in your homes. Do not attempt to emergency broadcast. Infection spreading." The fragmented message sent a chill through Mike, despite the growing heat of the day. He pulled over to the side of the road, trying to make sense of what he'd heard. As he sat there, his eyes were drawn to something in his rearview mirror. A car flipped on its side, smoke still rising from its crumpled hood. Instinctively, Mike got out of his truck and approached the wreck. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet street. "Anyone need help?" As he drew closer, he saw movement inside the car. Relief washed over him, quickly replaced by a growing sense of unease as he realized something wasn't right. The figure inside was moving in jerky, unnatural motions, its limbs bent at odd angles. Before Mike could process what he was seeing, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Two figures were staggering towards him from across the street. Their clothes were torn and bloodied, their movements uncoordinated and jerky. "Hey, you all right?" Mike called out, even as his instincts screamed at him to run. As they drew closer, he could see their faces, pale with sunken eyes and gaping mouths. Blood stained their chins and clothes, and a low, guttural moan escaped their lips. Mike's heart began to race as the reality of the situation hit him. These weren't people anymore. They were something else entirely. The news reports, the violence, the mysterious virus, it all suddenly made terrifying sense. Without thinking, Mike sprinted back to his truck, slamming the door shut just as one of the figures reached for him. Its hand smacked against the window, leaving a bloody smear. Mike fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. Come on," he muttered, relief flooding through him as the engine roared to life. He slammed the truck into gear and peeled away, leaving the gruesome figures in his rearview mirror. As he sped through the streets of Folsom, Mike's mind raced. The town he knew so well had transformed overnight into something out of a nightmare. Abandoned cars littered the roads, some with doors left wide open as if their occupants had fled in a hurry. Here and there, he caught glimpses of more of those things. Zombies. The word felt ridiculous, even in his thoughts, but there was no other way to describe them. Mike's instincts kicked in, years of outdoor survival experience and practical know-how coming to the forefront. He needed a safe place, somewhere defensible. His welding shop was the obvious choice. Sturdy walls, limited entry points, and filled with tools that could double as weapons if needed. As he approached the shop, Mike saw more of the undead stumbling about. He gunned the engine, swerving around them and screeching to a halt in front of the shop's roll-up door. Leaping out of the truck, he fumbled with his keys, acutely aware of the shuffling sounds growing closer. The lock clicked open, and Mike heaved the door up with a strength born of desperation. He dashed inside, grabbing the door and pulling it down, just as the first of the zombies reached for him. The metal door clanged shut, the sound echoing through the shop like a death knell for the world Mike had known. Breathing heavily, Mike leaned against the door, listening to the scraping and moaning on the other side. His mind whirled, trying to make sense of what was happening. The shop, once a place of routine and comfort, now felt like a fortress against an unimaginable threat. Mike's eyes darted around the familiar space, seeing it with new eyes. The welding torches, the metal sheets, the heavy tools, all potential weapons or materials for fortification. He moved quickly, dragging heavy shelving units in front of the windows and doors, creating a makeshift barricade. As he worked, the radio on his workbench crackled to life, making him jump. He rushed over, adjusting the dial until a clear voice came through. "This is an emergency broadcast. The infection has spread beyond containment. Citizens are advised to stay in their homes, avoid contact with infected individuals, and wait for further instructions. Military personnel are being deployed to major cities. If you are in a safe location, stay there. If you must travel, proceed with extreme caution. The infected are extremely dangerous and should not be approached under any circumstances. Repeat, this is an emergency broadcast." The message repeated, each iteration driving home the gravity of the situation. Mike sank onto a nearby stool, his mind reeling. The world as he knew it had ended, replaced by something straight out of a horror movie. As the reality of his situation sank in, Mike's practical nature took over. He needed supplies, food, water, medical equipment. He had some basics in the shop, but it wouldn't last long. He'd need to venture out soon to scavenge what he could from the ruins of Folsom. Mike's eyes fell on his welding torch, and a grim determination settled over him. He may not understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: he was a survivor. He'd faced challenges before, and he'd face this one too. With his skills and his tools, he'd find a way to make it through this nightmare. As the day wore on, Mike fortified his position, turning his welding shop into a stronghold. He crafted makeshift weapons from metal rods and sharpened tools, prepared Molotov cocktails from old rags and the acetylene tanks used for welding, and created a rudimentary alarm system using strings of metal scraps. By nightfall, exhausted but resolute, Mike sat in the darkened shop, listening to the occasional moan or shuffle from outside. The world had changed in the blink of an eye, but he was determined to adapt, to survive. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, his hand resting on a makeshift spear, Mike's last thoughts were of the challenges that lay ahead. The zombies may have taken Folsom, but Mike Walker wasn't going down without a fight. Tomorrow, he'd start reclaiming his town, one block at a time. The heat of routine had given way to the inferno of survival, and Mike was ready to face the flames. Chapter 3: The New Normal. The relentless summer sun beat down on Folsom, turning the once bustling town into a hellscape of sweltering heat and eerie silence. Mike Walker stood at the window of his welding shop, peering through a gap in the metal sheets he'd welded over the glass. The streets outside were a grotesque tableau of abandoned vehicles and wandering undead, their shuffling forms all stained a dark red from blood, and some zombies with their intestines hanging and draging on the ground while they shuffled down the streets, its constant reminder of the nightmare that had become reality. A week had passed since the world as Mike knew it had ended. In that time, he'd transformed his shop into a fortress, using his welding skills to reinforce every possible entry point. The familiar hum of machinery was now replaced by the occasional groan of the undead, gunshots in the distant background and the clanking of his homemade alarm systems. Mike's eyes narrowed as he spotted movement down the street. A small group of zombies was shambling towards an overturned grocery delivery truck, drawn by the scent of rotting produce. He watched them for a moment, his hand unconsciously tightening around the handle of his makeshift spear. A length of rebar he'd sharpened to a wicked point. "Gonna need to make a run soon," he muttered to himself, glancing at his dwindling supplies. The canned goods and bottled water he'd had on hand were running low, and he knew he couldn't stay holed up in the shop forever. With a resigned sigh, Mike moved away from the window and began preparing for a scavenging run. He'd ventured out a few times already, each excursion a heart-pounding dance with death. But necessity drove him, and he'd learned quickly that hesitation could be fatal in this new world. Mike donned his makeshift armor, thick leather welding gear reinforced with strips of metal, and gathered his weapons. The spear was his primary choice, allowing him to keep the undead at a distance, but he also carried a heavy wrench as a backup, a baseball bat wrapped with barbed wire and a few of his homemade Molotov cocktails. Before leaving, Mike paused at his workbench, running his calloused hand over the surface. The familiar feel of the scarred wood brought a lump to his throat as memories of simpler times flooded his mind. He pushed the emotions aside, steeling himself for what lay ahead. With a deep breath, Mike approached the roll-up door. He listened intently for any signs of immediate danger before disengaging his fortifications and slowly raising the door. The oppressive heat hit him like a wall as he stepped out into the sun-baked street, which felt like an oven. Mike moved with caution, his eyes constantly scanning for threats as he made his way towards the Palladio Shopping Center, which is located along the East Bedwell Street, one of the main throughways in Folsom. The once bustling mall was now a ghost town, its expansive parking lot a graveyard of abandoned cars and scattered debris. As he approached the main entrance, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A zombie, once a middle-aged woman in a now tattered sundress, half naked. She clearly had a boob job since they were perfectly firm without any help of a bra, or maybe it was because she was dead. She was lurched behind a car. Mike reacted instantly, driving his spear through its eye socket with a sickening crunch. He withdrew the weapon and watched the creature crumple to the ground, his stomach churning at the sight. "Sorry, ma'am," he murmured, a habit he'd developed to maintain some semblance of humanity in the face of the horrors he now faced daily. Inside the mall, the air was stale and heavy with the stench of decay. Mike moved from store to store, gathering what supplies he could find. A Nordstrom Rack store yielded some useful items, a sturdy backpack, hiking boots, and some clothing suitable for the heat. As Mike was stuffing the last of his finds into his pack, a chorus of moans echoed through the cavernous space of the mall. His head snapped up, adrenaline surging through his veins as he spotted a group of zombies shambling towards him from the far end of the parking lot. "Shit," he hissed, slinging the pack over his shoulder and readying his spear. There were too many to fight head-on, at least a dozen of the undead closing in fast. Mike's mind raced as he looked for an escape route. He knew he couldn't just run them all over with car. Contrary to the zombie movies, a full-grown fat adult zombie would actually wreck your car if you just hit them head-on. But the only exit not blocked in the parking lot was now blocked by a horde or zombies. Mike went towards the horde, ducking in between cars, his movement much faster than the zombies who moved like the Romero zombies. He started throwing his Molotavs at the horde. The bottles shattered on the ground, erupting into a wall of flames that engulfed the leading zombies. Their inhuman shrieks filled the air as they stumbled and fell, creating a fiery barricade that halted the advance of those behind. Mike didn't wait to see the full effect of his handiwork. He turned and ran, searching for another way out. He found it in the form of a service road, likely used by mall employees in better times. As Mike navigated the obstacle course of abandoned vehicles and scattered debris, his mind wandered to the people he'd known before the outbreak. His few close friends, the regulars at the Lazy Dog restaurant and bar, a local diner where he'd had breakfast nearly every morning, even the irritating neighbor who'd always complained about the noise from his shop. Were any of them still alive? Had they all succumbed to the infection, now wandering the streets as mindless husks? The weight of loneliness pressed down on Mike, threatening to overwhelm him. He'd always been something of a loner, more comfortable with his welding torch than with most people, but the utter isolation of the past week was taking its toll. As he approached the entry to where his shop is located, the Iron Point Business Park, his vehicle ran out of gas. With no means of getting more, he opened the door and stepped out of his vehicle. Cautious and looking around with his head on a swivel, he scanned the area. Movement in a nearby alley caught Mike's attention. He raised his spear, ready for another confrontation, but froze when he heard a sound that didn't belong in this world of groans and shuffling feet, a human voice. "Help! Please, somebody help me!" Mike hesitated, torn between self-preservation and the instinct to aid a fellow survivor. The voice called out again, more desperate this time, and Mike made his decision. He couldn't turn his back on someone in need, not when he might be the only person left in Folsom who could help. Cautiously, Mike entered the alley, his eyes straining in the dim light. He found the source of the cries, a man pinned beneath a fallen fire escape, his leg trapped by the twisted metal. "Oh, thank God!" The man gasped as Mike approached. "I thought I was done for." Mike quickly assessed the situation. The man was pale and sweating, clearly in pain, but showed no signs of infection. "How long you been stuck here?" Mike asked, already working to lift the metal structure. "Since yesterday afternoon," the man replied weakly. "I was trying to get to higher ground when the whole thing came down. Name's Tom, by the way." With a grunt of effort, Mike managed to lift the fire escape just enough for Tom to pull his leg free. The injured man cried out in pain as he moved, and Mike could see his ankle was badly swollen, possibly broken. "Can you walk?" Mike asked, already knowing the answer. Tom shook his head, gritting his teeth against the pain. "Don't think so. Look, just leave me a weapon or something. I don't want to slow you down." Mike considered his options. Leaving Tom here was as good as killing him, but bringing an injured man back to his shelter was a risk. In the end, his conscience won out. "Not happening," Mike said firmly. "My place isn't far. We'll get you patched up, then figure out next steps." With some effort, Mike managed to get Tom to his feet, supporting most of the man's weight as they made their slow way back to the welding shop. Every shuffling step felt like an eternity, Mike's nerves on edge as he watched for any sign of the undead. Finally, They reached the relative safety of Mike's fortified shop. As he helped Tom inside and secured the door behind them, Mike felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He'd saved a life today, but he'd also taken on a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for. As he set about tending to Tom's injuries with his limited first aid supplies, Mike realized that this was the new normal. Survival wasn't just about food, water, and avoiding the undead. It was about the hard choices, the moments of humanity in a world gone mad, and the connections forged in the crucible of crisis. The sun began to set outside, casting long shadows through the gaps in Mike's fortifications. As he shared a meager meal of canned beans with Tom, listening to the man's story of survival, Mike felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, there were more survivors out there. Maybe Folsom wasn't lost entirely. As night fell and the moans of the undead echoed in the distance, Mike settled into his makeshift bed, his mind racing with plans for the days ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but also new possibilities. In this harsh new world, every day survived was a victory. Every connection made a treasure. Mike closed his eyes, the weight of his new responsibility settling over him like a blanket. As he drifted off to sleep, his last thought was a quiet determination. To not just survive, but to reclaim his town, one day at a time, one life at a time. The zombies may have taken Folsom, but as long as people like Mike Walker still drew breath, hope remained. Chapter 4. Reclaimed Ground. The scorching sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate streets of Folsom. Mike Walker stood atop the roof of his welding shop, surveying the landscape that had once been his familiar hometown. The past few weeks had been a blur of survival, scavenging, and fortification, but now it was time to take the next step. "We can't keep living like this, Tom," Mike said, his voice gruff with determination. "It's time we start taking back what's ours." Tom, his ankle now healed enough to walk with a slight limp, nodded in agreement. "What's the plan, Mike?" Mike pointed towards the sprawling complex of the Folsom outlets in the distance. "That's our new base. It's got everything we need: space, resources, and defensible positions. We just need to clear it out and make it ours." The two men spent the next hour discussing strategy, their voices low to avoid attracting unwanted attention. As the last rays of sunlight faded, they climbed down from the roof and began preparations for the following day's mission. Dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink that seemed almost obscene in their beauty, given the horror that now walked the earth. Mike and Tom emerged from the welding shop, armed to the teeth with their makeshift weapons and homemade explosives. "Remember," Mike whispered as they crept through the silent streets, "we stick to the plan. Slow and steady wins the race." They approached the Folsom outlets cautiously, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The vast parking lot was a graveyard of abandoned, crashed, and burned-up vehicles, some with doors still flung open in testament to their owners' desperate flight. Dead bodies were scattered around the parking lot. The stank was unbearable in the summer heat. As they neared the main entrance, a low moan echoed from behind a nearby car. Mike raised his hand, signaling Tom to stop. With practiced ease, he readied his spear and waited. Moments later, a zombie stumbled into view, its dead black eyes fixing on the two men with mindless hunger. Mike didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, driving his spear through the creature's skull with a sickening crunch. As he tried to withdraw his weapon, it got stuck in the zombie's skull. Mike, with his size 12 boots, started kicking the zombie in the face until it slid off the end of the spear and made a splat sound when it hit the pavement. Finally still. "Nice one," Tom murmured, his own weapon at the ready. They pressed on, encountering small groups of the undead as they made their way through the complex. Mike's welding skills proved invaluable as they secured each section, using scavenged materials to reinforce doors and windows. By midday, they had cleared and secured the first block of stores. Sweat poured down their faces, the oppressive heat making every movement a struggle. They paused to catch their breath and rehydrate, taking shelter in a cleared-out Nike factory store. "We're making good progress," Tom said between gulps of water, "but there's still a lot of ground to cover." Mike nodded, his eyes scanning the store for anything useful. "We'll take it one section at a time. No rush, no mistakes." As they prepared to move on, a distant crash echoed through the complex. Both men froze, listening intently. The sound of breaking glass was followed by a series of inhuman shrieks that sent chills down their spines. "Sounds like we've got company," Mike growled, readying his weapons. "Let's go check it out." They moved cautiously towards the source of the commotion, the sounds growing louder as they approached. Rounding a corner, they came face to face with a horde of zombies pouring out of a broken storefront. "Shit!" Tom hissed, raising his makeshift axe. "There's too many of them!" Mike's mind raced, assessing their options. They couldn't take on the entire horde head-on, but retreating would mean losing all the ground they'd gained. His eyes fell on a nearby hardware store, and a plan began to form. "Follow me," he ordered, leading Tom towards the store. They slipped inside just as the first of the zombies noticed their presence. Mike quickly scanned the shelves, grabbing cans of paint thinner and other flammable liquids. "Help me with this," he grunted, dragging a heavy metal shelf towards the entrance. Together, they barricaded the door, the sounds of the zombies growing louder as they approached. Mike worked feverishly, combining the chemicals into a potent mixture. "What are you doing?" Tom asked, his voice tight with tension. "Making a surprise for our friends out there," Mike replied grimly. He soaked several rags in the mixture, stuffing them into bottles to create makeshift firebombs. "When I give the signal, we're going to open that door and light these babies up. Got it?" Tom nodded, his face pale but determined. They waited, listening to the zombies clawing at the barricade, the metal groaning under the assault. "Now!" Mike shouted, shoving the barricade aside. The door burst open, revealing a wall of decaying flesh and grasping hands. In unison, Mike and Tom lit their firebombs and hurled them into the crowd. The bottles shattered, erupting into balls of flame that engulfed the front ranks of the horde. Zombie shrieks filled the air as the fire spread, creating a barrier of flame between the survivors and the undead. "Run!" Mike yelled, grabbing Tom's arm and pulling him towards the back of the store. They burst through the emergency exit, the heat of the inferno at their backs as they sprinted away from the chaos. They didn't stop running until they reached the far end of the complex, finally pausing to catch their breath and assess the situation. Smoke billowed into the sky, and the sounds of the fire could still be heard in the distance. "That should keep them busy for a while," Mike panted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But we need to be ready for when the fire dies down." Tom nodded, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and exhilaration. "What's the plan?" Mike's gaze swept across the outlet complex, his mind already formulating strategies. "We need to set up choke points, create barriers they can't get through, and we need to find a way to draw them away from the areas we want to secure." They spent the rest of the day working tirelessly, using Mike's skills to fortify key positions and create elaborate traps for the undead. As the sun began to set, they stood atop one of the buildings, surveying their handiwork. "It's a good start," Mike said, a hint of pride in his voice. "But we've got a long way to go." Tom nodded in agreement, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the smoke from their earlier encounter still lingered. "Do you think we can really do this? Take back the whole place?" Mike was silent for a moment, considering the question. "We have to," he finally replied. "It's not just about survival anymore. It's about reclaiming what's ours, about building something in this mess of a world." As darkness fell, they made their way back to their newly established base camp in one of the cleared stores. Mike's mind was already racing with plans for the days ahead, expanding their territory, setting up sustainable food and water sources, and perhaps most importantly, searching for other survivors. The distant moans of the undead serving as a grim lullaby, Mike felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. They had taken the first steps towards reclaiming their town, towards carving out a safe haven in this nightmare world. As he drifted off to sleep, Mike's last thoughts were of the challenges that lay ahead. The zombies might have taken Folsom, but he was determined to take it back, one block at a time. The Folsom outlets were just the beginning. Soon, they would push outwards, reclaiming more of the town, maybe even reaching out to other survivors. Chapter 5: A Lone Survivor. The relentless summer heat bore down on Folsom another day. It's summertime here, and it's only getting hotter until fall. transforming the once bustling town into a desolate wasteland full of death. Months had passed since the initial outbreak, and the landscape had changed dramatically. Nature, unchecked by human intervention, had begun to reclaim the streets. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement, and vines crept up abandoned buildings. Wild dogs and cats ran unchecked. No more humans to capture or spay the animals to prevent breeding, creating an eerie juxtaposition of life and death. Mike Walker stood atop the roof of the Folsom Outlets, his makeshift watchtower offering a panoramic view of the town he once knew. His weathered face, now adorned with a scraggly beard, bore the marks of countless sleepless nights and grueling days. The welding goggles perched on his forehead glinted in the harsh sunlight, a reminder of the skills that had kept him alive in this new world. As he scanned the horizon, Mike's mind thought about Tom. It had been weeks since his companion had ventured out on a supply run and never returned. The loss weighed heavily on Mike's conscience, a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked in every shadow. "Should have gone with him," Mike muttered to himself, his voice hoarse from disuse. But he knew that someone had to stay behind to defend their hard-won territory. The Folsom Outlets had become more than just a base. It was a fortress, a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. Mike's eyes fell on the intricate system of traps and barriers he had constructed around the perimeter. Car parts, shopping carts, and whatever else he could scavenge had been welded together to create a maze-like defense against the undead. It was a masterpiece of improvisation, each piece carefully placed to funnel the zombies into kill zones where Mike could dispatch them from relative safety. A movement in the distance caught his attention. Through his binoculars, Mike spotted a small group of zombies shambling towards the mall. Their tattered clothes and decomposing gray flesh were a grim reminder of the world that had been lost. With a resigned sigh, Mike picked up his customized weapon, a welding torch modified to shoot concentrated flames. He had dubbed it the Zombie Fryer, a touch of dark humor in a world that had precious little to laugh about. As he made his way down to ground level, Mike's footsteps echoed through the empty corridors of the mall. The stores, once filled with the bustle of shoppers, now stood as silent tombs. He had cleared most of them, turning some into storage for his supplies, and others into workshops where he continually improved his defenses and weapons. Reaching the main entrance, Mike paused to check his gear. The leather welding apron he wore as makeshift armor was scarred and patched, each mark a story of a close call or a hard-won victory. His tool belt was laden with an assortment of weapons, a heavy wrench, a few of his homemade Molotov cocktails, and a sharp hunting knife. "Another day in paradise," Mike muttered sardonically as he stepped out into the scorching heat. The zombies were still a good distance away, giving Mike time to set up. He moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting his traps and ensuring his escape routes were clear. As he worked, memories of his old life flashed through his mind. The satisfaction of a well-done welding job, the camaraderie of sharing a cold beer with friends after work. Those simple pleasures seemed like a lifetime ago. As the zombies drew closer, Mike took up his position behind a barricade of welded shopping carts. The first of the undead stumbled into his trap, its foot catching on a tripwire. The mechanism Mike had rigged sprang to life, sending a sharpened piece of rebar through the zombie's skull. "One down," Mike whispered, readying his zombie fryer. The rest of the horde, drawn by the commotion, began to pour into the kill zone. Mike's finger tightened on the trigger, sending a jet of flame into the mass of rotting flesh. The air filled with the sickening smell of burning decay and the inhuman shrieks of the undead. For several intense minutes, Mike fought with grim determination. His traps took out several zombies, while his zombie fryer and well-placed Molotov cocktails accounted for the rest. When the last of the undead fell, Mike allowed himself a moment to catch his breath, the adrenaline slowly ebbing from his system. As he surveyed the carnage, a familiar emptiness settled in his chest. Another day survived, another battle won, but to what end? The loneliness of his existence weighed heavily upon him. Mike made his way back inside the mall, his footsteps heavy with exhaustion. He headed to what had once been a small Starbucks, now serving as his living quarters. The space was Spartan but functional, with a sleeping bag laid out on the floor and shelves stocked with his dwindling supplies. Collapsing into a chair, Mike pulled out a battered notebook, his survivor's log. He had started keeping it as a way to maintain his sanity, to remind himself that days were still passing, that time hadn't completely lost its meaning. As he jotted down the events of the day, Mike's thoughts turned to the future. How long could he continue like this? The supplies in Folsom weren't endless, and eventually he would need to venture further afield. The thought of leaving the relative safety of his fortress filled him with dread, but he knew it was inevitable. Setting aside the notebook, Mike reached for his most prized possession, an old handheld radio. He had scavenged it from an electronics store, hoping against hope to pick up any transmission, any sign that he wasn't the last person left alive in this hell. For hours, Mike sat there, slowly turning the dial, listening to the static. As always, there was nothing but the hiss of dead air, yet he couldn't bring himself to give up. Each night he would try again, clinging to the faint hope that someday someone would answer. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the skylights, Mike prepared for another night of vigilance. He checked his defenses one last time, ensuring that the alarm systems he had rigged throughout the mall were active. Returning to his makeshift home, Mike settled in for another lonely evening. He pulled out a can of beans, one of the few luxuries he allowed himself, and ate slowly, savoring each bite. Food was becoming scarcer, and he knew he would need to plan another scavenging run soon. He thought about the people he had known before the outbreak, his few close friends, the regulars at the local diner, even the annoying neighbor who always complained about the noise from his shop. Were any of them still out there? Had they found safety, or had they all succumbed to the infection? Sleep, when it came, was fitful and filled with nightmares. Mike dreamed of shambling hordes breaking through his defenses, of familiar faces twisted into grotesque masks of hunger and decay. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, his hand automatically reaching for the weapon he kept by his side. As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, Mike rose, his body protesting after another night on the hard floor. He went through his morning routine mechanically, a quick wash with precious water, a breakfast of stale crackers, and a thorough check of his gear. Standing at the entrance of the mall, Mike looked out over the parking lot, now overgrown with weeds. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of Folsom's water tower, a landmark that had once been a point of pride for the town. Now it stood as a silent sentinel over a dead world. Mike's gaze fell on a truck, parked near the entrance. He had been putting off a major scavenging run, but he knew he couldn't delay much longer. His supplies were running low, and he needed to search for more fuel to keep his generators running. With a heavy sigh, Mike began to prepare for the journey. He loaded the truck with empty containers for fuel and any supplies he might find. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this might be his last time leaving the safety of the Folsom outlets. Before climbing into the truck, Mike took one last look at the fortress he had built. It wasn't much, but it was home, the only safe place he knew in this nightmare world. Part of him wanted to stay, to huddle behind his walls and wait for... what? Rescue? The end of the world? No, he thought, shaking his head. Survival meant taking risks, pushing forward even when every instinct screamed to hide. With renewed determination, Mike started the engine, the rumble breaking the eerie silence of the morning. As he drove through the abandoned streets of Folsom, Mike's mind wandered to the challenges that lay ahead. The town he had known all his life was now alien territory, each familiar landmark transformed into a potential death trap. But he was a survivor, and he would keep fighting, keep pushing forward, no matter what horrors awaited him. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Mike's truck disappeared into the distance, leaving behind the relative safety of the Folsom outlets. Chapter 6. Allies in the Chaos. The scorching sun hung low on the horizon as Mike's truck rumbled to a stop outside an abandoned pharmacy. He had been driving for hours, scouring the outskirts of town for supplies, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. The familiar landmarks of his hometown had become alien and foreboding in the months since the outbreak. Mike climbed out of the truck, wincing as his boots crunched on broken glass. The Safeway pharmacy's windows were shattered, and the faded sign above the door swung lazily in the hot breeze. He gripped his modified welding torch tightly, the weight of it comforting in his calloused hands. "All right," he muttered to himself. "In and out. Quick and quiet." As he approached the entrance, a sound from inside made him freeze. It wasn't the familiar groan of the undead, but something else, a clatter, followed by a distinctly human curse. Mike's heart raced. After months of solitude, the prospect of encountering another survivor was both thrilling and terrifying. Cautiously, he peered through the broken window. In the dim light, he could make out a figure moving between the shelves, stuffing items into a backpack. The person was slight, definitely not one of the shambling corpses he'd grown accustomed to avoiding. Mike cleared his throat, loud enough to be heard, but not so loud as to attract unwanted attention. The figure spun around, and Mike found himself staring down the barrel of a pistol. "Don't move," a woman's voice hissed. "I've got enough problems without adding trigger-happy survivors to the list." Mike slowly raised his hands, careful to keep his welding torch pointed away from her. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not here to cause trouble, just looking for supplies, same as you, I reckon." The woman stepped forward, her gun still trained on Mike. She was in her late 30s, with short-cropped hair and eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Her clothes were worn but practical, and Mike noticed a red cross patch on her sleeve. "You're a nurse?" he asked, nodding towards the patch. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Was, before all this. Name's Sarah, and you are?" Mike Walker. I used to run the welding shop over on." A crash from outside cut him off. Both Mike and Sarah tensed, their attention snapping to the street. A group of zombies had rounded the corner, drawn by the sound of their voices. "Shit," Sarah hissed. "Back door, now." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed her backpack and darted towards the rear of the pharmacy. Mike followed close behind, his mind racing. The back door was chained shut, but Sarah produced a set of bolt cutters from her pack and made quick work of the lock. They burst out into a narrow alley just as the first of the undead stumbled through the front of the store. Mike slammed the door shut behind them, wedging a piece of debris under the handle to buy them some time. "This way," Sarah said, already moving down the alley. "I've got a safe house nearby." Mike hesitated for a split second, torn between following this stranger and making a break for his truck. But the sound of zombies crashing through the pharmacy made the decision for him. He fell into step behind Sarah, his welding torch at the ready. They weaved through back streets and abandoned lots, Sarah leading with a confidence that spoke of familiarity with the area. Finally, they came to a stop outside a small, nondescript house. Sarah quickly unlocked the door and ushered Mike inside. The interior was sparse but organized. Medical supplies were neatly arranged on shelves, and a map of Folsom covered one wall, marked with notes and colored pins. "Nice setup," Mike said, impressed despite himself. Sarah shrugged, setting down her backpack. "It works. So, Mike the welder, what's your story? How'd you end up raiding my pharmacy?" Mike gave her a brief rundown of his situation, the fortified Folsom outlets, his dwindling supplies, the months of isolation. As he spoke, he watched Sarah's expression shift from suspicion to something approaching sympathy. "Sounds rough," she said when he finished. "But smart, using your skills to fortify a place like that. I've been moving around myself. Too risky to stay in one place for long." Mike nodded, understanding her caution. "What about you? How'd an ER nurse end up playing lone wolf in the apocalypse?" Sarah's face darkened. "I was working when it all went down. The hospital. It was a nightmare. So many people infected, turning right there in the wards. I managed to grab some supplies and get out, but..." She trailed off, lost in the memory. "I'm sorry," Mike said softly. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant moans of the undead. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. "Look, I appreciate you not shooting me on sight, but I work alone. It's safer that way. So if you don't mind, I'd like you to leave in the morning." Mike felt a pang of disappointment. After months of isolation, the prospect of human companionship, even wary and temporary, was enticing. But he understood her caution. Trust was a luxury few could afford in this new world. "Fair enough," he said. "But before I go, maybe we could trade. I've got some tools, things I've welded together. Could be useful. And I'm guessing you've got medical supplies to spare? Sarah considered for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll trade in the morning. For now, get some rest. I'll take first watch. As Mike settled onto a worn couch, his mind raced with possibilities. Sarah's medical knowledge could be invaluable, and having an ally, even a reluctant one, might mean the difference between survival and joining the ranks of the undead. The night passed uneventfully, with Mike and Sarah taking turns to keep watch. As dawn broke, they prepared to part ways. Mike laid out some of his custom-made weapons and tools, while Sarah sorted through her medical supplies. As they traded, Mike couldn't help but notice Sarah's expert handling of the equipment he'd crafted. You seem pretty handy yourself, he commented. Sarah shrugged. Had to learn fast. Can't exactly call a repairman these days. Their trading done, Mike prepared to leave. But as he reached for the door, a commotion outside made them both freeze. The sound of breaking glass and inhuman shrieks filled the air. Damn it, Sarah hissed, peering through a gap in the boarded-up window. A whole horde of them. Must have followed our scent from yesterday. Mike's mind raced, assessing their options. We can't stay here, he said. They'll tear this place apart. We need to move. Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, lingering on the supplies she'd worked so hard to gather. I can't just leave all this, she said, her voice tight with frustration. Then we'll take what we can, Mike insisted. My truck's not far. If we can reach it, we might have a chance. For a moment, Sarah looked like she might argue, but another crash from outside made the decision for her. Fine, she said, grabbing her backpack and stuffing it with as many supplies as she could. But this doesn't mean we're partners or anything. This is a one-time deal. Got it? Mike nodded, already gathering his own gear. Understood. Now let's move. They burst out of the back door, immediately assaulted by the oppressive heat and the stench of decay. The alley behind the house was clear for the moment, but the sounds of the approaching horde were growing louder. Mike took the lead, his welding torch at the ready. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible, ducking through overgrown yards and abandoned lots. Every so often, a lone zombie would lurch into view, only to be dispatched by Mike's torch or Sarah's well-aimed knife. As they neared the pharmacy where Mike had left his truck, the full extent of their predicament became clear. The street was crawling with undead, drawn by the commotion of their earlier encounter. Shit, Mike muttered, surveying the scene. We'll never make it through that crowd. Sarah's eyes scanned the area, her medical training kicking in as she assessed the situation. Maybe we don't have to, she said, pointing to a nearby building. That's a butcher shop. If we can get inside, we might be able to use the smell to mask our scent. Mike nodded, impressed by her quick thinking. Worth a shot. Lead the way. They made their way to the butcher shop, Sarah picking the lock with practiced ease. Inside, the stench was overwhelming, but Mike forced himself to focus. They covered themselves in the foul-smelling remnants of meat, gagging but knowing it might be their only chance. Ready? Mike asked, his hand on the door. Sarah nodded grimly. As I'll ever be. They stepped out into the street, moving slowly and deliberately. The zombies milled about, their dead eyes passing over Mike and Sarah without recognition. It was working. Inch by agonizing inch, they made their way towards Mike's truck. Every step felt like an eternity, the moans of the undead filling their ears. Finally, they reached the vehicle. Easy now, Mike whispered, reaching for the door handle. Nice and slow. But as he opened the door, the hinge let out a loud creak. Dozens of rotting heads swiveled in their direction. Go! 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 Sarah yelled, all pretense of stealth abandoned. They scrambled into the truck, zombies closing in from all sides. Mike fumbled with the keys, his heart pounding in his ears. The engine roared to life just as the first undead hands began clawing at the windows. Mike slammed the accelerator, the truck lurching forward. Bodies thumped against the hood as he plowed through the crowd, Sarah clinging to the dashboard for dear life. As they broke free of the horde, Mike allowed himself a moment of relief. He glanced over at Sarah, seeing his own mix of terror and exhilaration mirrored in her eyes. Nice driving, she said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Mike chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse. Nice thinking with the butcher shop. Guess we make a pretty good team. Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a look of uncertainty. "Yeah, I guess we do," she said softly. As they drove towards the Folsom outlets, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions. Would Sarah stay? Could they trust each other? In a world where every day was a fight for survival, was there room for partnership? Chapter 7. The Boy in the Ruins. The Folsom outlets loomed before them, a fortress of concrete and steel rising from the desolate landscape. Mike guided the truck through the maze of barriers he had constructed, the familiar sight of his makeshift home bringing a sense of relief after their harrowing escape. As they pulled up to the main entrance, Sarah let out a low whistle. "Impressive setup you've got here," she said, her eyes scanning the intricate defenses. "You weren't kidding about your welding skills." Mike allowed himself a small smile of pride. "It's amazing what you can do with a welding torch and a lot of free time," he replied, his voice tinged with dark humor. They climbed out of the truck, the oppressive heat hitting them like a wall. Mike led Sarah inside, giving her a quick tour of the fortified mall. As they walked, he couldn't help but notice how her eyes darted from exit to exit, always assessing, always planning. It was a habit he recognized in himself, a necessary survival instinct in this new world. "So," Mike said as they reached what had once been the food court, now serving as his main living area, "what's the plan? You staying for a bit, or—" Sarah hesitated, her fingers absently tracing the outline of the medical cross on her sleeve. I'm not sure," she admitted. "This place is secure, I'll give you that. But I've learned the hard way that nowhere is safe forever." Mike nodded, understanding her caution. "Fair enough, but maybe we could work together for a while? Pool our resources, watch each other's backs?" Before Sarah could respond, a distant crash echoed through the mall. Both of them tensed, hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. "What was that?" Sarah hissed, her eyes scanning the shadows. Mike shook his head, already moving towards the sound. "Don't know, but nothing gets in here without me knowing about it." They crept through the abandoned stores, the silence broken only by their cautious footsteps and the occasional groan of settling metal. As they neared the source of the disturbance, a sporting goods store near the back of the mall, Mike held up a hand, signaling Sarah to stop. A figure was moving inside the store, small and quick, darting between shelves. It was too agile to be one of the undead, but that realization brought little comfort. In this world, the living could be just as dangerous as the dead. Mike took a deep breath, then called out, "Whoever's in there, come out slowly. We're not looking for trouble, but we're ready for it if that's what you want." For a moment, there was no response. Then a young voice, cracking with fear and puberty, called back, Please don't hurt me. I'm just looking for food." Exchanging a glance with Sarah, Mike lowered his weapon slightly. "Come on out, kid, nice and slow." A boy emerged from the shadows, his hands raised in surrender. He couldn't have been more than 14 or 15, though it was hard to tell beneath the grime and fear etched on his face. His clothes were tattered and too big for his skinny frame, and a backpack hung from one bony shoulder. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, her voice softening as she took in the boy's ragged appearance. "Danny," the boy stammered. "My name's Danny." Mike studied the kid, his mind racing. It had been months since he'd seen another survivor, let alone someone so young. "Where'd you come from, Danny? How'd you get in here?" Danny's eyes darted between Mike and Sarah, clearly weighing whether to trust them. Finally, he said, "I've been on my own for a while. Found a small gap in your defenses, near the loading docks. I didn't mean any harm. I was just so hungry." Sarah stepped forward, her medical training kicking in as she assessed the boy's condition. "When's the last time you ate, Danny?" The boy shrugged, his shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "Don't know. A couple of days, maybe?" Mike felt a pang of sympathy. He remembered all too well the gnawing hunger of those first few weeks after the outbreak, before he'd established his base here. "Come on," he said, gesturing for Danny to follow. "Let's get you something to eat, and then we can figure out what to do next." As they made their way back to the food court, Mike's mind whirled with the implications of Danny's arrival. The boy had found a weakness in his defenses, one that would need to be addressed immediately. But more than that, his presence raised questions Mike had been avoiding for months. What was the right thing to do in a world where morality seemed as scarce as fresh food? Sarah seemed to sense his inner turmoil. As Danny wolfed down a can of beans, she pulled Mike aside. "We can't send him back out there," she said in a low voice. "He wouldn't last a week." Mike nodded, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I know, but keeping him here, it's a risk. More mouths to feed, more potential for things to go wrong." "Everything's a risk these days," Sarah countered. "But maybe this is a chance to do something good, to remember what it means to be human." Their conversation was interrupted by Danny's voice. "I can help," he said, setting down the empty can. "I'm good at finding things, at getting into small spaces, and I'm a fast learner. Please don't make me leave." The desperation in the boy's voice struck a chord in Mike. He saw in Danny's eyes the same fear and loneliness he'd been battling for months. With a sigh, he made his decision. "All right, kid, you can stay, but there are rules. You do as Sarah and I say, no questions asked. This isn't a democracy, it's survival. Got it?" Danny nodded eagerly, relief washing over his features. "Got it. Thank you so much." As Sarah began checking Danny for injuries, Mike stepped away, needing a moment to process the sudden change in his carefully ordered world. He made his way to the roof, his personal watchtower and refuge. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and red that seemed almost obscene in their beauty, given the horror that now walked the earth. Mike leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape of his hometown, now alien and foreboding in the growing twilight. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Sarah approaching. She joined him at the railing, her presence oddly comforting after so many months of solitude. "Danny's resting," she said. "Poor kid's exhausted, but he seems healthy enough, all things considered." Mike nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "This changes things," he said after a moment. "Having the kid here, it's not just about survival anymore. We've got a responsibility now." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said, "Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's what we both needed." Mike turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since they'd met. He saw in her eyes the same mix of determination and vulnerability he felt in himself. In that moment, he realized that Sarah was right. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were the beginnings of something more, a community, however small and fragile. "We'll need to step up our supply runs," Mike said, his mind already racing with plans. "And I'll have to patch that hole Danny found. Maybe set up some alarms in case there are others out there." Sarah nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "We'll figure it out, together." As they stood there, watching the last light fade from the sky, Mike felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was a dangerous feeling in this world, but he clung to it nonetheless. The next few days were a flurry of activity as they adjusted to their new dynamic. Danny proved to be a quick study, eagerly absorbing everything Mike and Sarah taught him about survival in this new world. His youthful energy and optimism were infectious, bringing a lightness to the grim routine of daily life that Mike hadn't realized he'd been missing. One afternoon, as Mike was showing Danny how to maintain the generators that powered their fortress, the boy suddenly asked, "Do you think there are others out there? Other survivors, I mean." Mike paused, considering his words carefully. "I'm sure there are," he said finally. "World's a big place. But finding them, that's the trick." Danny nodded, his young face serious. "My dad, he always said that in times of trouble, you've got to stick together. That's how you survive." Mike felt a lump form in his throat at the mention of Danny's father. The boy rarely spoke of his life before, and Mike hadn't pressed. Some wounds were too fresh, too deep to probe. "Your dad sounds like a smart man," Mike said softly. Danny's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "He was. He saved me, you know, when it all started. Got me out of the house, told me to run and not look back. I heard him, fighting them off. I should have stayed, should have helped." Mike set down his tools and placed a hand on Danny's shoulder. "Hey now, you did what you had to do. Your dad, he wanted you to live, and you have. You're here, you're safe. That's what matters." Danny nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Thanks, Mike, for everything. You and Sarah, you saved me too." As Danny turned back to the generator, Mike found himself blinking back tears of his own. He realized that in saving Danny, they had saved a part of themselves as well. The part that still believed in hope, in the possibility of a future worth fighting for. Later that evening, as they sat around a small fire on the roof, sharing a meager dinner of canned vegetables and dried meat, Sarah broached a subject they'd all been avoiding. "We need to think about the future," she said, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Not just tomorrow or next week, but long term. If we're going to rebuild, to create something lasting, we need a plan." Mike nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "You're right. We've been in survival mode for so long, it's hard to think beyond the next meal, the next supply run. But we owe it to ourselves, to Danny, to try." Danny, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "What about other survivors? Maybe we could find a way to contact them, to bring them here?" Mike and Sarah exchanged a glance, both recognizing the risk and potential in Danny's suggestion. "It's dangerous," Mike said slowly. "Opening ourselves up like that, not everyone out there is friendly." But he paused, weighing his words. "But maybe it's a risk worth taking. If we're going to have a real future, we can't do it alone." Sarah nodded, a determined glint in her eye. "We'll need to be careful, set up some kind of screening process. But Danny's right, we're stronger together." As they continued to discuss possibilities, Mike felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since the world ended. They were no longer just surviving, they were planning for a future. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. That night, as Mike lay in his bed listening to the soft breathing of Sarah and Danny nearby, he allowed himself to imagine what that future might look like. A community rising from the ashes of the old world, built on the foundation of trust and shared survival they were forging here. It wouldn't be easy. The undead still roamed beyond their walls, and the challenges of rebuilding in this harsh new world were daunting. But for the first time in months, Mike felt truly alive. He had found more than just allies in the chaos. He had found a family. Chapter 8. The Price of Survival. The scorching summer sun beat down mercilessly on the Folsom city as Mike, Sarah, and Danny prepared for their most ambitious supply run yet. Weeks had passed since Danny's arrival, and their little family had fallen into a rhythm of sorts. But their supplies were dwindling, and they knew they needed venture further afield if they were to survive. Mike stood at the entrance, double-checking the modifications he'd made to his truck. He'd reinforced the frame with welded metal plates and fashioned a crude battering ram from scavenged materials. It wasn't pretty, but it would give them a fighting chance if they encountered a horde. Sarah approached, her backpack laden with medical supplies and the few weapons they'd managed to cobble together. "Ready?" she asked, her voice tight with tension. Mike nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "As we'll ever be. Where's Danny?" As if on cue, the teenager appeared, lugging a crate of empty containers for water and fuel. "Got everything on the list," he reported, a hint of excitement in his voice despite the danger ahead. Mike felt a pang of guilt. Danny was too young to be facing such risks, but they had no choice. In this new world, age was a luxury none of them could afford. "All right, team," he said, trying to inject some confidence into his voice. "Let's go shopping." They piled into the truck, Danny squeezed between Mike and Sarah in the cab. As they pulled away from the safety of their fortress, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that they were tempting fate. But the growling of his stomach and the worried glances Sarah cast at their dwindling medical supplies steeled his resolve. Their destination was a large grocery store on the outskirts of Folsom, one they'd avoided until now due to its distance from their base. As they drove through the abandoned streets, the familiar landmarks of their hometown served as grim reminders of all they'd lost. "Look," Danny said suddenly, pointing out the window. "The movie theater. Mom used to take me there every Saturday." Mike glanced at the dilapidated building, its marquee now a jumble of fallen letters. "Maybe one day we'll get it up and running again, kid," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Sarah placed a comforting hand on Danny's shoulder. "We'll make new memories," she said softly. "Better ones." As they neared the grocery store, Mike slowed the truck, his eyes scanning for any sign of the undead. The parking lot was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles, many with doors still flung open in testament to their owners' desperate flight. I don't like this, Sarah muttered, her hand tightening on the makeshift spear she held. It's too quiet. Mike nodded, feeling the same unease. Stay alert. We go in fast, grab what we can and get out. No heroics, no detours. Got it? Danny and Sarah nodded, their faces set with determination. As one, they exited the truck, weapons at the ready. The heat hit them like a physical force, the asphalt shimmering in the midday sun. They approached the store cautiously, Mike in the lead with his welding torch modified into a flamethrower. The automatic doors were jammed open, offering a clear view of the darkened interior. The stench of rotting food and something far worse wafted out to greet them. Masks on, Sarah instructed, pulling a cloth over her nose and mouth. And watch for spores. We don't know how this thing spreads. Inside, the store was a maze of toppled shelves and scattered debris. They moved carefully, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Danny clutched a list of essential items, his eyes darting from shelf to shelf. Over here, he whispered, gesturing towards the canned goods aisle. Looks like no one's touched this section. They worked quickly, filling their backpacks with whatever non-perishables they could find. Mike kept watch, his nerves on edge as he scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a crash echoed from the back of the store. They froze, weapons raised. What was that? Danny hissed, his voice trembling. Before Mike could respond, a low moan filled the air, followed by another and another. Shit, he cursed. We've got company. Lot of it. Move. They scrambled towards the exit, but it was too late. A horde of zombies poured out from the stockroom, their dead eyes fixed on the living flesh before them. Mike's flamethrower roared to life, creating a wall of fire between them and the undead, but he knew it wouldn't hold for long. Back door, Sarah yelled, already pulling Danny in that direction. Mike, cover us! Mike retreated slowly, the heat from his weapon adding to the already sweltering temperature. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes as he tried to keep the zombies at bay. They burst out into the loading dock, only to find more of the undead waiting for them. Sarah's spear flashed in the sunlight as she took down the nearest zombie, while Danny swung a crowbar with surprising strength, crushing a rotting skull. The truck, Mike shouted, gesturing towards their vehicle. Go! I'll hold them off! Sarah hesitated for a split second, her eyes meeting Mike's. In that moment, a lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. Then she nodded, grabbing Danny's arm and sprinting for the truck. Mike turned to face the oncoming horde, his flamethrower sputtering as the fuel ran low. He backed away slowly, picking his targets carefully. Each burst of flame bought precious seconds for Sarah and Danny to reach safety. But the zombies kept coming, an endless tide of decay and hunger. Mike felt his back hit the truck just as his weapon gave out, the flame dying with a pathetic whimper. Mike! Danny's voice cut through the moans of the undead. The boy was leaning out of the truck window, his hand extended. Come on! With a burst of desperate strength, Mike leapt for the truck, his fingers grasping Danny's. Sarah gunned the engine, the tires squealing as they peeled away from the horde. Mike pulled himself into the cab, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. That was too close, he gasped, watching in the rearview mirror as the zombies grew smaller in the distance. Sarah's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her face a mask of tension. We can't do this again, she said, her voice shaking. We nearly lost you back there. Mike nodded, the reality of their near miss sinking in. You're right, we need a better plan. This scavenging, it's not sustainable. Danny, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. What about farming? My dad, he used to have a vegetable garden, said it was important to be self-sufficient. Mike and Sarah exchanged a glance, both seeing the potential in Danny's suggestion. That's not a bad idea, kid, Mike said slowly. We've got that open area on the roof of the mall. With some work, we could turn it into a garden. Sarah nodded, a spark of hope in her eyes. And we could set up rain catchments for water. Maybe even try raising some chickens if we can find any. As they drove back to the Folsom outlets, their near disaster slowly fading into memory, they began to plan. The idea of creating something, of building a sustainable future rather than just scraping by, filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. But their optimism was short-lived. As they approached their fortress, they saw smoke rising from one of the barricades. No, Mike breathed, his heart sinking. No, no, no. Sarah accelerated, the truck bouncing over debris as they raced towards their home. As they drew closer, they could see that part of the outer wall had been breached. Zombies milled about the entrance, drawn by the commotion. How? Danny asked, his voice small and frightened. How did they get in? Mike's mind raced, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Then it hit him, the gap Danny had used to enter the mall weeks ago. In the excitement of their new family dynamic, he had forgotten to fully seal it. My fault, he said grimly, reaching for his backup weapon. I didn't fix the hole you found, Danny. Thought I had more time. Sarah's face hardened with determination. No time for blame now. We need to take back our home. They parked a safe distance away, gathering what weapons and supplies they had left. Mike looked at Danny, seeing the fear in the boy's eyes. You don't have to come, he said softly. Sarah and I can handle this. But Danny shook his head, gripping his crowbar tightly. No, this is my home too. I'm fighting. Mike felt a surge of pride, tinged with sadness at the loss of Danny's innocence. All right then, let's do this. Together. They moved as one, a family forged in the crucible of survival. Mike led the charge, using the last of his Molotov cocktails to clear a path through the zombies at the entrance. Sarah's spear flashed in deadly arcs, while Danny proved surprisingly adept with his crowbar. Inch by bloody inch, they reclaimed their territory. The battle seemed to last for hours, though it was likely only minutes. By the time they reached the inner sanctum of the mall, all three were exhausted, covered in gore and sweat. As the last zombie fell to Sarah's spear, an eerie silence descended. They stood there, panting, surrounded by the carnage of their victory. Danny was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Is it over? Mike nodded, surveying the damage. For now, but we've got work to do, lots of it. They spent the next few days in a frenzy of activity, repairing the breach and burning the bodies of the fallen zombies. The stench of smoke and decay hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. As they worked, they talked, planning for the future. Danny's idea of a rooftop garden took shape, with Mike welding together planters from scavenged metal. Sarah began cataloging the plants they would need, her medical knowledge proving invaluable in selecting herbs with both nutritional and medicinal properties. One evening, as they sat on the roof watching the sun set over their battered but unbroken home, Mike voiced the thought that had been nagging at him. We got lucky, he said quietly. If we'd been gone any longer. Sarah nodded, her hand finding his in the growing darkness. We need to be smarter, plan better, and, she hesitated, then plunged on, and we need to think about finding others, building a real community. Danny, who had been listening intently, spoke up. But how? It's not like we can put up flyers or something. Mike chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. No, but we've got that old radio equipment. Maybe we could set up some kind of broadcast, let other survivors know we're here. As they discussed the possibilities, Mike felt a familiar mix of hope and trepidation. Opening their doors to others was a risk, but after their close call, he understood the need for a larger support network. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Mike looked at Sarah and Danny, this unlikely family he had found in the midst of chaos. They had survived against all odds, but survival wasn't enough anymore. It was time to start living again, to build something lasting from the ashes of the old world. Chapter 9. The Final Stand. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Mike, Sarah, and Danny gathered on the roof of the Folsom outlets, their eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of the Folsom Prison Museum. The imposing structure stood as a grim reminder of the world that was, and potentially a treasure trove of supplies they desperately needed. Are we sure about this? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with concern. It's farther than we've ever gone before. Mike nodded, his jaw set with determination. We don't have a choice. Our food stores are running low, and the garden won't produce enough to sustain us through winter. The museum's our best shot at finding preserved supplies. Danny, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, suddenly spoke up. My dad used to work there as a guard. He always said they kept emergency rations in the basement, enough to last months. Mike and Sarah exchanged a glance, both recognizing the pain in Danny's voice at the mention of his father. That's good intel, kid, Mike said softly, placing a hand on Danny's shoulder. "It might just save our lives." As they made their final preparations, Mike couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. The prison museum was nearly 2 miles away, through streets they hadn't scouted in months. There was no telling what horrors awaited them. Sarah seemed to sense his apprehension. As they loaded the last of their gear into the truck, she pulled him aside. "We don't all have to go," she said in a low voice. "One of us could stay behind, keep the home fires burning." Mike shook his head. "We're stronger together. Besides," he added with a grim smile, "I've got a feeling we're going to need all hands on deck for this one." The drive to the museum was tense, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Danny clutched his newly fashioned spear, a creation born of Mike's welding skills and the boy's growing proficiency with weaponry. Sarah kept her eyes on the road, one hand on the wheel, the other on her medical bag, ready for any emergency. As they approached the museum, the true scale of their task became apparent. A sea of undead milled about the entrance, drawn perhaps by some lingering scent of humanity within the building's walls. "Jesus," Mike breathed, taking in the scene. "There must be hundreds of them." Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "We can't fight through that. It's suicide." But Danny was already pointing towards the back of the building. "There!" he exclaimed. "The service entrance. Dad used to use it all the time. It might be clear." With no better options, Mike steered the truck around the perimeter, careful to avoid drawing attention. To their relief, the service entrance was indeed clear, save for a few straggling zombies that they quickly dispatched. "All right," Mike said as they gathered at the door, weapons at the ready. "We go in fast and quiet. Danny, you lead the way to the basement. Sarah, you're on medical and backup. I'll take point. Any sign of trouble, we abort. Got it?" They nodded, faces set with grim determination. With a deep breath, Mike forced open the door, wincing at the screech of rusted hinges. The interior of the museum was a maze of shadows and decay. Display cases lay shattered, their contents strewn across the floor. The air was thick with dust and the lingering stench of death. Danny moved with surprising confidence, leading them through the twisting corridors. "This way," he whispered, gesturing towards a nondescript door. "The stairs to the basement are through here." As they descended into the darkness, the sounds of the outside world faded away, replaced by the eerie echo of their own footsteps. Mike's flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing rows of shelves stocked with canned goods and other non-perishables. "Jackpot," Sarah breathed, already moving to examine the supplies, but their elation was short-lived. A low moan echoed through the basement, followed by another and another. From the shadows emerged a group of zombies, their prison guard uniforms hanging in tatters from decaying flesh. "Dad?" Danny's voice cracked as he recognized one of the approaching figures. Mike's heart clenched at the pain in the boy's voice, but there was no time for sentiment. "Fall back!" he shouted, already moving to intercept the nearest zombie. The battle that ensued was brutal and chaotic. In the confined space of the basement, their usual tactics were useless. Mike's flamethrower was too dangerous to use, forcing them to rely on close-quarters combat. Sarah's spear flashed in the dim light, taking down zombie after zombie with deadly precision. Danny fought with a fury born of grief and rage, his smaller size allowing him to duck and weave between the grasping hands of the undead. But for every zombie they felled, 2 more seemed to take its place. They were being pushed back, cornered against the shelves of supplies they had come to claim. "We need to get out of here," Sarah yelled, her voice barely audible above the moans of the undead. Mike's mind raced, searching for a solution. His eyes fell on a rack of old prison riot gear, and an idea began to form. "Danny!" he shouted. "The riot shields! Grab them!" Understanding dawned on the boy's face. He darted forward, snatching 3 of the heavy plastic shields from the rack. Mike and Sarah formed a protective circle around him as he distributed the shields. "On my mark," Mike instructed. "We form a phalanx. Push forward, don't stop for anything. Ready?" Sarah and Danny nodded, their faces set with determination. Now, as one, they surged forward, shields locked together. The zombies crashed against their makeshift barrier, but the riot gear held. Inch by bloody inch, they forced their way through the horde, pushing towards the stairs. Just as they reached the bottom step, disaster struck. A zombie, crawling on the ground, managed to grab Danny's ankle. The boy cried out in surprise, his shield slipping from his grasp. Without hesitation, Mike dropped his own shield, spinning to face the threat. His welding torch, repurposed into a brutal mace, came down with bone-crushing force on the zombie's skull. "Go!" he roared, shoving Danny towards the stairs. "I'll hold them off." Sarah hesitated for a split second, her eyes meeting Mike's. In that moment, a lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. Then she nodded, grabbing Danny and racing up the stairs. Mike turned to face the oncoming horde, his back to the narrow stairway. He fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed, each swing of his weapon buying precious seconds for Sarah and Danny to escape. But the zombies kept coming, an endless tide of decay and hunger. Mike felt his strength beginning to wane, his arms growing heavy with exhaustion. Just as he thought all was lost, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Mike, catch!" Danny's face appeared at the top of the stairs, his arm cocked back. Something arched through the air, glinting in the dim light. Mike's hand shot out instinctively, closing around the handle of a fire axe. With renewed vigor, Mike swung the axe in wide, devastating arcs. Zombie after zombie fell before him, their rotting bodies piling up at the foot of the stairs. Finally, blessedly, the onslaught began to slow. Seizing his chance, Mike turned and sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. He burst out into the main floor of the museum, gasping for breath. Sarah was there in an instant, her hands running over him, checking for injuries. "Are you bit?" she demanded, her voice tight with fear. "Mike, are you bit?" He shook his head, still too winded to speak. Danny appeared at his side, pressing a water bottle into his hands. Mike drank deeply, the cool liquid reviving him. "We need to move," Sarah said, already gathering their scattered supplies. That noise will have drawn every zombie for miles. As if to punctuate her words, a crash echoed from the front of the museum. The horde outside had breached the main entrance. "The truck," Mike gasped, finally finding his voice. "If we can reach it..." They moved as one, a well-oiled machine born of months of survival together. Mike took point, his newly acquired fire axe at the ready. Sarah guarded their rear, while Danny, loaded down with as many supplies as he could carry, stayed between them. The main floor of the museum had become a battleground. Zombies poured in from the front entrance, their dead eyes fixed on the living flesh before them. Mike's axe flashed in the dim light, clearing a path through the chaos. They burst out of the service entrance, the sunlight momentarily blinding after the gloom of the museum. The truck sat where they had left it, a beacon of hope in the sea of undead that now surrounded the building. "Go!" Mike shouted, taking up a defensive position. "Get it started. I'll cover you." Sarah and Danny sprinted for the vehicle, dodging grasping hands and snapping jaws. Mike stood his ground, his axe a whirlwind of destruction, buying them the precious seconds they needed. The truck's engine roared to life just as Mike's strength began to falter. He stumbled backwards, narrowly avoiding the clutches of a particularly aggressive zombie. "Mike!" Danny's voice cut through the chaos. The boy was leaning out of the truck's window, his hand extended. "Come on!" With a final burst of desperate energy, Mike leapt for the truck. His fingers closed around Danny's, the boy's surprising strength pulling him to safety. Sarah gunned the engine, the tires squealing as they peeled away from the museum. As they sped back towards the Folsom outlets, the adrenaline of battle slowly faded, replaced by a bone-deep wariness. Mike slumped in his seat, his mind replaying the narrow escapes, the moments where death had seemed certain. "We made it," Sarah said softly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "We actually made it." Danny, sandwiched between them, suddenly burst into tears. The emotion of the day, the encounter with his zombified father, it all came pouring out in great, heaving sobs. Mike and Sarah exchanged a glance over the boy's head, both recognizing the need for comfort. Without a word, Sarah pulled the truck over to the side of the road. For a long moment, they simply sat there, holding each other. They were battered, exhausted, and traumatized. But they were alive. They had faced their greatest challenge yet and emerged victorious. As Danny's sobs subsided, Mike spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "We're going to be okay," he said, as much to himself as to his makeshift family. "We've got food now, supplies. We can make it through the winter." Sarah nodded, a spark of hope in her eyes. "And come spring, we'll start reaching out. finding others, building something real. Danny wiped his eyes, looking up at them with a mixture of grief and determination. Dad would have wanted that, he said softly. A new start, a better world. As they drove the final stretch back to their fortress, Mike's mind was already racing with plans. The Folsom Outlets would become more than just a safe haven. It would be the seed from which a new community would grow. The road ahead would be hard, fraught with dangers both familiar and unknown. But as Mike looked at Sarah and Danny, this unlikely family forged in the crucible of apocalypse, he knew they could face anything together. Chapter 10. A New Dawn. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold as Mike stood atop the Folsom Outlets, surveying the landscape before him. The months since their harrowing mission to the Folsom Prison Museum had brought significant changes to their little community. What was once a desperate struggle for survival had slowly transformed into something resembling a life. Mike's calloused hands rested on the railing of their newly constructed rooftop garden, the metal still warm from his welding torch. Row upon row of planters stretched out before him, filled with sprouting vegetables and herbs. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a tangible sign of hope in a world that had seemed devoid of it for so long. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie. Sarah approached, her medical bag slung over her shoulder, ready for another day of tending to their small but growing community. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, coming to stand beside him. Mike nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Never thought I'd see anything grow in this hellscape again. It's something." Sarah's hand found his, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "We've come a long way," she mused, her eyes scanning the fortified perimeter of their home. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it." Their moment of peace was interrupted by the crackle of the radio clipped to Mike's belt. Danny's excited voice came through, tinged with static. "Mike, Sarah, you need to come down to the command center. We've got something." Exchanging a glance, Mike and Sarah hurried down from the roof. The command center was what they'd started calling the former security office of the mall, now repurposed as their communications hub. Danny had thrown himself into the task of reaching out to other survivors, spending countless hours tinkering with radios and broadcasting equipment. They found the teenager hunched over a console, his face illuminated by the glow of various screens and dials. "Listen to this," he said, barely containing his excitement as he adjusted a dial. A voice, scratchy and faint but unmistakably human, filled the room. "Anyone out there? This is Sergeant Maria Vasquez of the California National Guard. We are establishing a safe zone in Sacramento. If you can hear this message, please respond." The message repeated, each iteration sending a jolt of electricity through the room. Mike, Sarah, and Danny stood in stunned silence, the implications of what they were hearing slowly sinking in. "My God," Sarah breathed. "We're not alone." Mike's mind raced with possibilities and potential dangers. "It could be a trap," he said cautiously. "We've heard rumors of raiders using similar tactics." Danny shook his head vehemently. "I don't think so. I've been monitoring this frequency for weeks. They've been broadcasting consistently, always with the same message. If it was raiders, they would have changed tactics by now." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And the National Guard, if anyone had the resources to establish a real safe zone, it would be them." Mike paced the small room, weighing their options. The idea of a safe zone, of reconnecting with a larger community, was tempting. But the thought of leaving the security of their fortress, of risking everything they'd built, filled him with dread. "We can't just ignore this," Sarah said softly, reading the conflict on Mike's face. "We've talked about reaching out, about building something bigger. This might be our chance." Danny spoke up, his young face serious beyond his years. "We could send a scouting party. Check it out before committing everyone." Mike nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "All right, we'll do it. But we need to be smart about this. We'll gather everyone, put it to a vote. If we're going to take this risk, it needs to be a group decision." The next few hours were a flurry of activity as they assembled their small community. In addition to Mike, Sarah, and Danny, they had taken in a handful of other survivors over the past months. A retired couple, a former firefighter, and a young woman who had been a computer programmer in the old world. As Mike laid out the situation, he could see the mix of hope and fear on their faces. The idea of a larger safe zone was alluring, but the dangers of the outside world were all too real. "We've built something here," Mike said, his voice carrying across the gathered group. "Something real, something worth protecting. But we've always known we couldn't stay isolated forever. This could be our chance to be part of something bigger, to help rebuild." Sarah stepped forward, adding her perspective. The medical supplies and expertise they might have, it could make a real difference. And there's strength in numbers. The debate that followed was intense but respectful. Each person voiced their concerns and hopes, weighing the potential benefits against the very real risks. In the end, the vote was unanimous. They would send a scouting party to investigate the safe zone. Mike, Sarah, and their former firefighter John volunteered for the mission. Danny, much to his frustration, was tasked with maintaining communications and coordinating their return. As they prepared for the journey, Mike found himself in their makeshift armory, carefully selecting weapons and supplies. Sarah joined him, her medical bag already packed and ready. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, noticing the tension in his shoulders. Mike sighed, running a hand through his beard. "Just wondering if we're doing the right thing. We've lost so much. The idea of risking what we've built here." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "I know. But think about what we could gain. Real security, resources, a chance to be part of rebuilding society. It's worth the risk." Mike nodded, drawing strength from her conviction. "You're right, as usual," he added with a wry smile. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cool, a welcome respite from the usual heat. The entire community gathered to see them off, the atmosphere charged with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Danny approached Mike as they were loading the last of their supplies into the truck. The boy, no, young man now, Mike corrected himself, had grown so much in the months since they'd found him. "Be careful out there," Danny said, his voice thick with emotion. "And come back. Promise me you'll come back." Mike pulled him into a fierce hug. "We will. I promise. You hold down the fort while we're gone, all right?" As they pulled away from the Folsom outlets, Mike couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. How many times had they ventured out, never certain if they'd return? But this time was different. This time, they weren't just fighting for survival. They were reaching for something more. The journey to Sacramento was tense but uneventful. They stuck to back roads, avoiding the major highways that were often clogged with abandoned vehicles and roaming undead. John's knowledge of the area proved invaluable, guiding them through shortcuts and around potential danger zones. As they approached the outskirts of Sacramento, they began to see signs of organized activity. Makeshift barricades had been erected at key intersections, and they spotted patrols moving with military precision. "Looks like the real deal," John murmured, his eyes scanning the horizon. They were stopped at a checkpoint several miles from the city center. Armed guards in National Guard uniforms approached their vehicle, weapons at the ready but not pointed directly at them. "Identify yourselves," a stern-faced woman demanded, her insignia marking her as a sergeant. Mike spoke calmly, his hands visible on the steering wheel. "We're survivors from Folsom. We heard your broadcast and came to investigate. I'm Mike. This is Sarah and John." The sergeant's expression softened slightly. "I'm Sergeant Vasquez, the one from the broadcast. You're the first to respond in weeks." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. They were escorted to a processing center, where they underwent medical examinations and debriefings. Sarah's medical knowledge immediately caught the attention of the staff, and she was whisked away to consult with their doctors. Mike found himself in a meeting with the base commander, a grizzled colonel named Harrison. As he described their setup in Folsom, the resources they'd gathered, and the skills they'd developed, he could see the interest growing in the colonel's eyes. "We've been trying to expand our safe zone," Harrison explained, "but we're stretched thin. A fortified outpost in Folsom, with a team that already knows the area, that could be invaluable." The implications of his words sank in. They weren't just being invited to join the safe zone, they were being offered a chance to be a vital part of it, to maintain their independence while gaining the support and resources of a larger community. As the sun began to set, Mike, Sarah, and John gathered to discuss their findings. The safe zone was real, and the opportunities it presented were beyond anything they could have hoped for. But the decision to uproot their entire community was not one to be made lightly. "We need to put it to a vote," Mike said firmly. "Everyone back home needs to have a say in this." Sarah nodded in agreement. "But Mike, I think this is it. This is our chance to do more than just survive, to really live again." John, who had been quiet for much of the day, spoke up. "I've seen how they operate here. It's not perfect, but it's organized. They're thinking long-term about rebuilding. That's more than I've seen anywhere else since this all started." As they prepared to return to Folsom, Mike felt a sense of anticipation building in his chest. They had come so far, survived so much. The thought of joining a larger community, of being part of something greater than themselves, filled him with a hope he had almost forgotten. The drive back was filled with excited discussion of possibilities. Sarah talked about the medical advancements they could bring to their community, while John mused about the potential for expanding their defenses. Mike listened, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in a long time, they were planning for a future beyond mere survival. As the Folsom outlets came into view, Mike felt a surge of pride. This place had been their refuge, their fortress against the chaos of the world. But now, it could become something more, a beacon of hope, a vital outpost in the effort to reclaim their world. Danny was waiting for them at the entrance, his face a mix of relief and excitement. As Mike stepped out of the truck, he was struck by how much the boy had grown, not just in height, but in confidence and maturity. "Well?" Danny asked, barely containing his eagerness. "What did you find?" Mike looked at Sarah and John, then back at Danny and the gathered community members. A slow smile spread across his face as he prepared to share their news. "We found hope," he said simply. "We found a new beginning." As the sun set on another day in this changed world, Mike knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The Folsom outlets had been their sanctuary in the darkest of times. Now, it would become a cornerstone in the foundation of a new world. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be struggles, setbacks, and sacrifices. But as Mike looked at the faces of his makeshift family, he felt a sense of certainty. They had survived the unsurvivable. They had found each other in the chaos of a world gone mad. And now, they would help build a future brighter than any of them had dared to imagine. A new dawn was breaking, not just for their small community, but for humanity itself. And they would be there to meet it, stronger together than they ever could have been alone.